everyone. Welcome to Ready, Set, Go. This is a webinar series which is sponsored by HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, also known as SNAPS. My name is Tony Gallo. I work at ICF International, and I will be your moderator for today. The Ready, Set, Go webinar series, and for those of you that may be wondering, SET is an acronym which stands for SNAPS E-Learning Tuesdays, will be held every Tuesday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The Ready, Set, Go webinar series provides valuable information and insights for Continuum of Care's HMIS administrators, grantees, project sponsors, and other stakeholders on a variety of topics focused on community planning and capacity building. So, on behalf of SNAPS, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. Today's webinar is an introduction to the Continuum of Care Checkup. On today's webcast, we are lucky to have national experts presenting: Ann Oliva, Kevin Kissinger, and Tom Albanese. Kate Lyons and Celeste Palmer will be the resource advisors for today's webinar, which means they will be attempting to field as many of your questions as they can. Ann is the director of HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, as most of you know. Before coming to the government, Ann worked as the Community Partnership at the Community Partnership for the Prevention of Homelessness, where she was involved in providing new service options to meet the underlying needs of those without shelter. Tom Albanese provides consulting and technical assistance services as an associate with APT Associates. Tom has provided planning, development, implementation, and management support for housing and homeless programs since 1992. Tom is one of the lead developers of the CoC Check-up process and also presently provides TA for homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing program grantees, as well as TA to HUD related to HEARTH implementation, HMIS data standards, etc. Kate Lyons, one of our resource advisors, has over 17 years experience in the nonprofit field, managing public and private grant programs for the U.S. Departments of Housing and Urban Development, Labor, and Education. Prior to joining ICF, she was the Chief Operating Officer at the Coalition for the Homeless of Houston-Harris County. She has worked a lot with the Continuum of Care application process and HMIS. Celeste Palmer, our other resource advisor, is a research assistant on ICF's homelessness team. She has worked on the CoC Check-up and the materials being developed in support of some of the new HEARTH regulations. Next slide, please. Before we get started with the presentation, I just want to make a couple of logistical announcements. Today's webinar will last approximately 1 hour. We are recording it. The webinar recording and the accompanying PowerPoint presentation will be posted next week on the HUD Homelessness Resource Exchange, or HRE, website, which is accessible at www.hudhre.info. For webinar participants who would like to follow along and make notes to the presentation slides for this webinar are available right now on the HRE website, and a direct link to the document can be found in the reminder email that was sent to you by GoToWebinar. We have a lot of people with us today. We had approximately 880 individuals register for this webinar. Because of the large size of the audience, all attendees will remain on mute for the duration of the webcast. Next slide, please. All of your content questions are important to us. However, during today's webinar, we will not have the time to answer your questions live. Please submit them either using the left panel or actually the right GoToWebinar panel. There's a place there where you can see where you can actually type in your question. We will do our best to answer them. The resource advisors will answer them in a chronological manner, and we'll get to the ones that they can't. However, if we cannot get to all of your questions, please submit them after the webinar through HUD's virtual help desk at the web address on your screen. Under the program system, what you need to do is choose CoC Structure, and as the topic, choose CoC Check-up. Slide 5, please. As a reminder, you'll remain muted throughout the call. But again, you can submit any questions, concerns, or technical matters that you have via the GoToWebinar questions dialog box on your screen that I had mentioned previously. And again, materials referenced during this webinar are available on the HUD HRE. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Anna Oliva.
Great, thank you so much, Tony. And welcome everybody to the introduction to the CoC Checkup webinar. We're quite excited to offer the CoC Checkup, which is really the culmination of nearly 2 years of work that started just after the passage of the Homeless Emergency Assistance and Rapid Transition to Housing Act, which we all shorthand as the HEARTH Act, which was signed by President Obama in 2009. The HEARTH Act itself represents the first major change to the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act since the early 90s. And we've been working very hard since the passage of the Act to develop the 6 sets of implementing regulations and guidance that we'll have more to share about later on in this year. And really in the very near future, we're going to be starting to roll out those regulations. As we did our work on the HEARTH Act regulations and guidance, HUD and our technical assistance providers have been working to develop this Continuum of Care checkup. It's a new process designed by HUD to help CoCs determine their current capacity and performance, as well as the degree to which they are prepared for HEARTH implementation. The shorthand, we call it sort of HEARTH readiness. So using a self-administered online tool, the CoC Checkup helps CoCs to rate their proficiency across various functional domains and indicators, examine your own data, and that's something that I think is really important for folks to really start looking at. Looking at your trend data that is contained in the Homelessness Data Exchange, or called the HDX, which houses right now the point-in-time data, the housing inventory chart data, and some other types of data. And using all that information to establish a Continuum of Care action plan to guide capacity and performance improvement. The results obtained through the CoC Checkup process will create a baseline against which your CoC can measure progress from year to year. Additionally, starting next year, continuums that request technical assistance from HUD will be required to have completed the CoC Checkup. The results and the action plan that is sort of the culmination of the checkup process will serve as a starting point for any HUD technical assistance. Fundamentally, we believe that preventing and ending homelessness requires effective and efficient local systems of care that allow various individual providers to work in concert and toward common goals. With the passage of the HEARTH Act, local and statewide continuums are now formally recognized as systems of care. And if funding is appropriated by Congress, in the future, there may be federal funding through the Continuum of Care annual competition to support the administrative and related costs of operating a CoC, such as CoC planning. As of right now, we will have to see how the budget plays out for 2012, but I commit to all of you that as soon as we have some additional information on how the budget ends up for the homeless assistance grants programs, I will be sending out via the listserv one of our update messages that gives you details on what we should expect in the coming year. So, but for the time being, while the budget is still being developed by Congress, we really still need to prepare for the HEARTH Act and redouble our efforts to address homelessness. The CoC Checkup provides continuums with a means to look at capacity and performance now and set a course for further capacity and performance improvements going forward. You know, I think that in the times of tight budgets, we have to really focus on strategic thinking, and this tool is really going to help you do strategic thinking. So can I have the next slide, please? Today's session is really meant to orient you to the Continuum of Care checkup process. You should come away from today's session knowing the purpose of the Continuum of Care checkup, the 3 stages of the checkup, the corresponding schedule, and the final products that you can expect from the process. You should also learn how to access and use the Checkup online self-assessment tool. Next slide, please. This presentation is designed to introduce the Continuum of Care leads and key Continuum of Care stakeholders to the Continuum of Care checkup process. We will provide an overview of the checkup, including the purpose, what the CoC checkup process entails, and how leads and stakeholder respondents navigate the actual tool. This information is meant to complement emailed instructions that will be sent to Continuum of Care leads. We did actually do an email last night, and we will follow up with another email later in the week. So those key leads and stakeholders who have been invited to complete the Continuum of Care self-assessment will get that information. Next slide, please. There are going to be 3 stages to the Continuum of Care checkup process. Stage 1 is Continuum of Care stakeholder assessment. Stage 2 is Continuum of Care review of stakeholders assessment and review of Continuum of Care data. And stage 3 is the final self-rating and the development of the action plan. Next slide, please. The Continuum of Care checkup will start in November and will end in March. CoC leads should have received an email yesterday, which was an introduction to the Continuum of Care checkup process. You will receive, as I mentioned a moment ago, another email later on this week, which has specific instructions. Those instructions will invite CoC leads to work with local stakeholders and their CoC lead decision-making group to identify up to 20 local stakeholders representing various constituencies who can complete the online self-assessment tool. The online self-assessment tool will open on November 10th. Leads and stakeholders will have approximately 2 months to complete self-assessment. Next slide, please. Thank you. When the online self-assessment tool closes in January, CoC leads will then be able to generate an aggregate summary report of stakeholder responses to help their continuum identify areas in need of improvement. Continuums will also be able to access a new dashboard report in the Homelessness Data Exchange, the HDX, that will include tables and graphs of housing inventory chart, point in time count, and AHAR, Annual Homeless Assessment Report data. HUD will conduct another webinar at that time to provide specific instructions for the next stages of the CoC checkup, as well as make available tools and guidance on how to interpret the self-assessment survey and the HDX data. During stage 2, continuums will be asked to review stakeholder self-assessment ratings and the HDX, and then use that information to determine final self-assessment ratings for each indicator and establish a CoC action plan. Next slide, please. In February, the online self-assessment tool will reopen to allow Continuum of Care leads to enter their final self-assessment ratings and report their CoC's action plans. Once these steps are completed, participating continuums will be able to request HUD-funded technical assistance. CoCs will have until early March to enter their final ratings and action plans. As was indicated earlier, the CoC checkup process is intended to help CoCs help themselves. It is fundamentally a self-improvement process. As such, and this is very important, I got a lot of these questions when I go out and talk to different continuums. HUD will not look at individual Continuum of Care results from the checkup, and this is very important, nor will we use the information that is submitted as part of that checkup as part of the annual competition. So those 2 things are completely divorced from each other, and really it would behoove continuums to be as honest with themselves as possible in the checkup process so that you end up with an action plan that really can address the needs that are the needs in your community. So I just want to be clear with everybody, this is your process. Please take advantage of it to further improve your Continuum of Care, the work that you're doing to prevent and end homelessness. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Tom Albanese, who will provide an overview of the CoC Checkup self-assessment tool and instructions for completing the tool. Tom?
Great, thank you, Ann. So as Ann mentioned, in this next section of the webinar today, we're going to walk CoC leads and other stakeholders who are listening today through the process for accessing and completing the CoC Check-up online self-assessment tool. And we hope to provide instructions that would supplement the instructions that you'll be receiving later this week. Next slide, please. So as noted earlier, the CoC Checkup process begins once CoC leads receive the introductory email, which you all should have received yesterday. There'll be further instructions sent later this week that will provide more detailed instruction for accessing the tool and initiating the Continuum of Care checkup process. The second email that will be sent this Thursday will include a unique user ID and temporary password for CoC leads, so you can log into the CoC Lead Portal and initiate the process. You'll be able to access the CoC Lead Portal by selecting CoC Check-up under the Request TA tab at the top of the Homeless Resource Exchange or HUD HRE homepage. The second email will also provide, as I noted, detailed instructions as well as other supplementary information related to the checkup process and how to proceed with changing your password and inviting respondents to complete the CoC self-assessment tool. CoC leads will then be asked to identify up to 20, but no less than 6, local stakeholders to complete the CoC self-assessment tool. The process for selecting stakeholders to participate is up to each CoC. HUD will not dictate which particular individuals in your continuum should be selected to complete a tool. Rather, that will be up to each CoC lead working in tandem with your CoC lead decision-making group. HUD strongly encourages CoC leads to work with your decision-making group to identify stakeholders who can represent all facets of the CoC and your capacity and performance. Next slide, please. At a minimum, HUD has identified various stakeholders who should complete the self-assessment tool. This includes the CoC lead, the HMIS lead for the CoC, one representative for each emergency shelter grant or homelessness prevention rapid rehousing program grantee, and at least one CoC provider representative, a provider who offers services and or housing as part of the Continuum of Care service array, and 2 other Continuum of Care stakeholders. HUD recommends that at least one stakeholder be a consumer representative who is currently or formerly homeless and is an active participant in the CoC governing process or is otherwise familiar with the CoC governance and functioning. Respondents who represent CoC providers or consumers are further encouraged to communicate with and seek input from other providers and consumers when completing the self-assessment tool in order to provide a more thorough and representative response on behalf of that stakeholder group. Ultimately, as I indicated, it's up to the CoC to determine the combination and the specific individuals who will complete the CoC Checkup self-assessment tool. It's critical that CoCs be thoughtful and transparent about which stakeholders are invited to complete the self-assessment. As Ann noted, this is your process, and it's important that folks who assist in assessing the CoC's capacity and performance are both knowledgeable about the CoC and are willing to be honest about their assessment of the CoC. Because the CoC Checkup is meant to be a self-help tool for CoCs, and these surveys will be used as a tool to determine areas in need of improvement, respondents should be honest. Otherwise, the process itself really will not have anywhere near the value it might. Note also that, as the slide indicates, there are 4 required respondent types, not specific individuals per se, but rather persons who represent a given type of respondent. And that includes the CoC lead, the HMIS lead, at least one ESG HPRP grantee representative, and at least one continuum of care provider. If no one from these categories completes the self-assessment tool, the overall continuum of care checkup self-assessment will be considered incomplete. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to turn to the CoC Lead portal and some of the login steps and initial steps that CoC Leads will need to take to initiate the checkup process. As you can see, this is a screenshot of what the CoC Lead portal login page looks like. When a CoC Lead goes to HUD HRE, they will, as noted, select the CoC Checkup Lead Portal link, which will be under the Request TA tab at the HUDHRE.info homepage. Next slide, please. Once CoC Leads log in with their user ID and temporary password that's provided in the email the CoC Lead will receive later this week, at that point, then CoC Leads will be prompted to change their password to be something unique and something that they can use going forward. They will also be asked to enter the name, email address, phone number, organization, if there is an organization represented, an appropriate respondent type from the list above for each person in your community who has been invited to complete the self-assessment tool. Obviously, CoC Leads would not be expected to know the list of persons on day one as of, say, this Thursday, but rather it's expected that might take a few weeks working with your lead decision-making group to identify those prospective respondents before this information can be entered into the system. So it's important to have this information ready before going into the CoC Lead portal so you can be prepared to enter all the respondent information as you can see here on this screen. Once the respondent information has been entered, the CoC Lead will click the Send Invitation button at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. It's circled on the slide. At that point, the system will automatically send an email with a link to the CoC Checkup self-assessment tool and instructions to each stakeholder respondent entered. That email will be coming from the CoC Lead, or it will be appear as though it's coming from the CoC Lead. So it'll be very important to be in communication with prospective respondents so they're aware that they're going to be receiving this email, that the email will be generated automatically from the system, and that, of course, if they have questions, they should circle back to CoC Leads and or submit questions to the HUD HRE Helpdesk. The CoC Lead themselves will also receive a copy of each email that's sent to respondents, so CoC Leads will have that for reference. Next slide, please. Once a CoC stakeholder is invited to complete the self-assessment, as I noted, that stakeholder will receive an email containing a URL link to the CoC self-assessment tool. That will be a unique link that the CoC stakeholder will want to hold on to. So stakeholders who receive an email invitation with the link should save that email or otherwise save that link because they might need to reference that link and use it later as they work on completing their tool. When a respondent enters the CoC self-assessment tool by clicking on the link, they'll be prompted to complete the required fields on the Welcome to the CoC Checkup page, and we'll turn to that in a moment. Please know that the self-assessment responses will be kept confidential. All responses to the survey will be de-identified and aggregated before they're shared with other CoC members or with the CoC Lead, or for that matter, even HUD, to ensure participant confidentiality. At no time will a CoC Lead be able to go into the system and look at a particular stakeholder respondent's answers or survey to see what they are responding to in the survey. That will be anonymous to the CoC lead and other stakeholders as well as to HUD. Next slide, please. So at the welcome page for CoC stakeholder respondents, once the stakeholder goes to that page, they'll see that various contact information will be requested. In particular, CoC stakeholders will be asked to identify which respondent group they represent, their organization name, their first name, and contact information. It's critical at this stage that the respondent type that the stakeholder is selecting matches the respondent type that they've been identified as by the CoC lead or by the decision-making group. So that's just an aside. But that respondent type should match up with what they've been identified as. Once that information is entered, the CoC respondent will click the next button at the bottom of the page to continue on through the Checkup online tool. Note that respondents should be sure to verify their information and certainly their email address, and they'll be prompted to re-enter their email address so that information is correct in the system. Please note as well that that the CoC self-assessment tool, once the respondent type has been selected, will generate questions that are specific to that respondent type. And we'll talk in a moment about how that works within the system. But essentially, respondents who are, let's say, HMIS leads will get questions that are unique to HMIS leads that might represent questions that really are only best answered by an HMIS lead. So, for example, self-assessment indicators that a consumer might respond to would include some of the same but different indicators that an HMIS lead might respond to. At the same time, an HMIS lead might be asked questions that relate to data collection that a consumer may not know the answer to and thus wouldn't be asked. Next slide, please. On the main CoC Checkup page, respondents will be asked to select whether they're ready to start the assessment. There will be some additional instructions on this page which will provide instruction as to how to move from page to page. We're going to talk a little bit today about those instructions, but the welcome page itself also provides that orientation to the tool. The Start Assessment button, as you can see, is on the right-hand side of the screen, and that initiates the survey. Respondents also have an opportunity to print a blank assessment tool at this point so they could use it for reference as they work on the self-assessment tool itself. I would strongly encourage folks who are just starting the self-assessment, who want to orient to the tool and the questions. Before diving into the online tool, it might be helpful to print the assessment. There are more than 220 total indicators within the Continuum of Care checkup. Again, not every respondent will be asked 220 different questions around depending on their respondent type. But nonetheless, it may be helpful to print that the self-assessment tool so respondents can orient themselves to the questions and perhaps even work on answering the questions in advance of going into the tool and entering them online. I would also suggest that for providers or consumers, those that are representing broader constituencies, you might want to print the tool and share it with, say, a consumer advisory group or a provider advisory group and talk through some of the key questions that you think are most important to get broader input on. And that's another method for ensuring that the responses are really as representative as possible. All self-assessments must be submitted, however, using the online tool. There is no process for submitting a paper version of the tool itself. Next slide, please. So before we look at the tool, it's important to orient everyone to how the tool is designed, how the checkup self-assessment is structured. There are 4 domains in the checkup self-assessment that reflect the various sort of capacities and functioning of a continuum. That includes CoC governance and structure, includes CoC plan and planning process, CoC infrastructure and administrative capacity, as well as CoC housing and services. So as a system of care or as a crisis response system, CoCs have these various facets as a system, and the checkup is designed to walk respondents through various facets of the CoC in this model. So there's a degree of standardization to thinking about continuums as systems of care. Next slide, please. Within each domain, respondents will see that there are various elements that break out that domain into smaller segments, and then within each element there are indicators. The elements represent the standards or the characteristics that a high-functioning CoC might demonstrate. And within each element, there are then indicators that point to whether or not a CoC is achieving that element. Indicators, as I noted, are listed under each element. As you walk through the tool, you'll see various indicators. Indicators include specific characteristics, practices, etc., that relate to each element and provide an indication as to whether or not that element's being achieved. In this example, you can see that the first domain, which is CoC governance and structure, the very first element under that domain is the CoC has a clear direction and purpose. An indication of that is that the CoC has a written vision, mission, and/or purpose statement that guides its functioning and its operation. Next slide, please. So once stakeholders and stakeholder respondents enter the tool and start the assessment, they'll see these questions populate, and they'll see that each indicator has either a scaled response or a yes/no response that can be selected. Respondents must provide answers to all the questions on the screen in order to move to the next screen. Moreover, many questions in the self-assessment are populated depending upon the respondent's answer to the previous question. So in some instances, depending on how a question is answered, there may be a follow-up question that's asked of the respondent. For example, if you answer yes to question 1.1.1, which is that the CoC has a written vision, mission, and/or purpose statement, you'll then be asked the following question. The vision, mission, purpose statement clearly states the purpose of the CoC. This is meant to help elaborate on whether or not the vision, mission, or purpose statement is in fact a clear reflection of what the respondent feels the purpose of the CoC is. If you answer no to the first question, however, you'll not be prompted to answer the second question, but rather we'll move on to the next question in the survey. At the bottom of each survey page is a comment box as well. Comments can be entered on one page. They'll continue to populate on the following pages. In other words, if you write a comment in the comment box on one page, that should carry over to the next until you start a new domain. So in essence, there's one comment box per domain, and those comments can be added onto as you move through the checkup tool itself within a given domain. The purpose of the comment box is to allow respondents to elaborate on their responses, to provide a little more context or explanation to what they've entered into the system, so there's a record of how they understood the question or how they answered the question for future reference. Please note as well that answers will be automatically saved once the next button at the bottom of the screen is selected. And the next button must be clicked on in order to move to the next screen. If you're not able to complete the assessment in one sitting, your survey would be bookmarked on the last page that you saved. So in other words, if you're in the tool and you only complete half a page and then exit the tool without clicking next, your responses on that page are not saved. When a respondent re-enters the survey by clicking on that unique URL that will come in the invitation email, they'll be taken back to the page they last worked on. To navigate back to a survey page to edit an answer, simply select the previous button. So it is possible once you're in the tool to go backwards in the tool and change answers previously entered. At that point, then changes can be made and you could proceed forward through the tool. Next page. The online self-assessment tool also includes various links to different resources. It's helpful, particularly for folks who are not familiar with all the terminology that CoC leads may be familiar with, or where there's terms that are used that are just simply less common to find definitions. And so the tool includes a glossary that can be referenced by users, and that glossary button is found at the top of the page on each page that you work through as you're completing the tool. And the glossary, again, includes various definitions for terms that one would find throughout the tool. If a respondent has more nuanced questions, however, that the glossary doesn't answer, or there's simply not a clear understanding of a given question, then at that point, or if for that matter, if there are technical difficulties, then you can select the CoC Helpdesk link, which is located in the sitemap area at the bottom of the screen. This slide shows that it's in somewhat small print, but it's at the bottom of the screen, and you can see the CoC Helpdesk link. You'll be directed at that point to submit your question under the CoC Structure Virtual Help Desk at the HUDHRE.info site. Next page, please. Once respondents have completed all required questions, at that point, then you'll come to the end of the survey, and you'll be given an opportunity to either return to the survey and review responses, or to submit your survey responses. Once the submit button is clicked, then at that point the survey is submitted, and there's no ability to go back and edit the survey. Next slide, please. However, there will be a prompt once that's clicked to just ensure that you as a respondent are ready to submit the survey, and it will again sort of make note that you at that point once you click OK, you can't go back in to change any of your assessment answers after OK is selected. However, I should note that once you click OK, it is still possible to go into the tool and print out your survey responses that you can have then as a record of what you entered into the system. I'm going to point out again and just really strongly emphasize that all survey responses, all responses within the tool are anonymous. There is no ability for CoC leads to go in and look at individual responses, nor will HUD be able to look at individual responses that have been entered into the tool. Next slide, please. So as a final wrap up, just to reiterate some of the next steps that Anne walked us through earlier, and to also just make some additional points, we want to really strongly emphasize that this is a relatively time-sensitive process. The tool will close, the self-assessment online tool will close on January 13th. So continuous have roughly 2 months to identify stakeholder respondents and work with stakeholders to access the tool and have stakeholders enter their responses. It seems like a lot of time, but on the other hand, we also have holidays coming upon us, and HUD recognizes that many CoCs, in fact, HUD is encouraging CoCs to really be thoughtful and thorough and transparent in how stakeholders are selected, which may require some time to convene the lead decision-making group or other stakeholders to make those decisions before anyone even accesses the tool. Nonetheless, it is a hard date. The tool itself will close on January 13th. Once the tool closes, CoC leads will be able to generate an aggregate report using the CoC Lead Portal. That aggregate report will, again, not provide any specific respondent answers, but rather will provide an aggregation of responses across all stakeholders, showing the average responses for any given indicator and some summary information that will be useful to share with stakeholders to assess their results. From January 14th to February 20th, CoCs will be asked to review those assessment results along with CoC inventory and population data contained in the HDX. This is what Anne had referenced earlier, is that there will be a new dashboard report that will be made available at that time containing HDX point-in-time, housing inventory, AHAR, and related data that can be used for self-analysis purposes. And the CoC will be asked to identify those areas that are most in need of improvement, as well as establish a CoC action plan during that time frame. Then on February 20th, the CoC Checkup self-assessment tool will reopen, and CoC leads will then be able to enter their final self-ratings for each indicator, as well as the CoC action plan. And let me just stress that part of the process here is not to simply go with a composite score on each indicator that 20 different stakeholders come up with as part of their aggregate self-assessment, but rather the process allows for a CoC to review that those aggregate results and then come up with a final rating. So if the aggregate results across 20 stakeholders show that an average score on a given indicator was a 3, but the CoC determines by way of a transparent process in reviewing those results with its decision-making group that in fact they're a 4 on that indicator, then when the checkup reopens, the CoC will be able to go in and for each indicator enter their final self-rating. That final self-rating may be the aggregate score from the stakeholder self-assessment, or it may be some adjustment to that score based on what the CoC believes is a more correct or accurate rating. At that point, CoCs will have until March 2nd to enter their final self-rating as well as their CoC action plan. And then on March 2nd, the checkup will close. There will be additional information provided to CoCs related to stages 2 and 3. There will be a webinar that provides more detailed instructions about these steps and that will walk CoC leads and other stakeholders through those steps sometime in mid-January. That's being scheduled as we speak. That's it for our walkthrough of the Continuum of Care checkup, and at this point, I'd like to hand it back over to Tony. Tony, are you there? I'm not sure if we've lost Tony, but I'm not able to hear her. Tony? Okay, she may be having audio difficulties. Let me go ahead and wrap up our webinar today. We don't want to keep folks waiting. I want to thank
Sorry
Ann
about that.
Oh, there you are.
Sorry, for some reason the phone just died. Thanks very much to our panelists today and to our resource advisors, and thanks to all of you for participating today and for taking part in the checkup. As a reminder, if you have additional questions, please submit them via the HUD HRE virtual help desks at www.hudhre.info. I imagine that most of you know how to use the help desk or how to access them, but for those of you who do not, at the HUD HRE, under the Ask a Question tab, select the Virtual Help Desk dropdown. For the program system, select CoC Structure, and then under Topic, select the CoC Check-up. Just a reminder, this webinar recording and PowerPoint presentation will be posted next week on the HUD HRE website. We'd like to encourage all CoC stakeholders who will be completing the online self-assessment tool to watch the recording for additional orientation to the CoC Checkup process and the self-assessment tool. Later this afternoon, all of you who registered for this webinar will receive an email from GoToWebinar in which you're asked to answer a few questions about today's webinar. Please use the link provided in the email. We really want to know what you thought about this webinar, as we do about all of the webinars we're offering in this series. We will have a webinar at our regularly scheduled time next week. We are not quite certain yet of the topic, but within the next day or two, we will let you know the topic and how to register. So again, thanks very much and enjoy the rest of your day.